you mentioned something like the economic approach to war, and what does that even mean? And you say it critically involves opportunity cost, which is, a very economistic-y term. Maybe can you explain that? And maybe how, so somebody who isn't thinking in terms of opportunity cost might understate the effectiveness of strategic bombing?
Yeah, exactly. So I think there are two things. One thing I would say before, the opportunity cost is definitely central. So and put quickly, it's like in this bombing context, the Germans are pulling resources from other theaters to defend against this Allied bombing. And so the opportunity cost for them is that they could be using these fighters to basically destroy Soviet ground formations in the Eastern Front. And so the opportunity cost there is the next best alternative, which is being forgone. But before we get really into that, I think the first thing is that the economic approach really emphasizes attrition, emphasizes kind of guns, manpower, material over and above kind of things like morale or things like the decisive battle. And so that's if you think about a more the economic approach is really exemplified in this book by Philip O'Brien called Why the War Was Won. It's full of numbers and full of tables, and it's just he's counting the number of planes being destroyed, counting the number of tanks. And I'm not a military strategist. People in the actual military might dispute or disagree on or not always hold this position. But the economic approach is to say, in the industrial war, at least, it's these resources, even in pre-industrial war, it's these resources which matter, as opposed to the so-called decisive battles. So the battles are important because that's where resources are being lost. But ultimately, it's that rather than the psychological or strategic or tactical kind of battle, which makes all the difference. And so opportunity cost is critical because when you evaluate the bombing campaign, a naive historian might look at, say, industrial production. And so industrial production doesn't go down in Germany in, say, 1943 into 1944. I think it does start to in late 1944, but it's not going down, it's going up as this bombing campaign is going on. So the naive historian might say, well, production's going up at the same time as American Air Force are bombing these factories. Clearly the bombing's not working. But they're neglecting that the Germans are pulling all these resources from other parts of the war effort to defend against the bombing. And so actually the air attacks are having a big strategic impact. It's just you're not seeing it necessarily solely in industrial production. You need to evaluate this counterfactual. If the Americans had decided against bombing, the Germans would have had far more airplanes. They would have to put less resources in kind of anti-aircraft guns, of which they're building a huge amount. And they would have been investing in or using these fighter planes, these Messerschmitts. They would have been using them on the Eastern Front, gaining air superiority and potentially holding off or even defeating Russian armies.
Okay, yeah, it's funny how what you're saying dovetails with my son, older teenage son at this point. I play Axis and Allies with him, and I think it's something like he's won 19 games and maybe I won one, and I'm not sure if I'd even won one. And I keep getting better with each loss. I keep learning from my mistakes, and he just keeps staying ahead of me. And at some point, I did ask him, why does this? How come when I did this, it doesn't work, but when you do the same thing that he was going through and it's not worth me trying to remember the exact, but it was an example of what you're talking about here, Mark, where he was like, well, no, because I had you pinned down here, so that meant you couldn't, combine these forces over here, so that's why this happened. But when we flipped roles and I was playing your side, I did, you didn't attack me here. You were holed up over here because you were too defensive, and therefore it freed me up to go, and it was it was like you're saying, it wasn't that tactically I was doing anything stupid, but it was just my big, long-term strategic decisions were not wise compared to his. And so anyway, and also going along with this, I'm probably butchering the quote, but I read somewhere, I think the context was, a lot of Americans, of course, are Civil War buffs. And somebody said something like, the amateur focuses on tactics, the professional focuses on supply lines. That doesn't sound like a sexy thing to worry about. How are we going to make sure, we still have supply lines going back to our production centers to bring up, material. Who care? No, I want to talk about another cavalry does this and we do this charge. But if you get surrounded and, you just run out of food, that's kind of game over.
That's my my impression. I'm not an expert on Civil War, but when I first started reading about it, it's kind of you think, see Robert E. Lee or Jeb Stuart, they're these heroic figures, or not seen as heroic, but at least in terms of their battlefield tactics, they're lauded. They were lauded at least in the past. But then as you understand more about kind of how war really works, then you actually appreciate General Grant He's like the top general of the Civil War, not because he's flashy. He's the opposite of flashy, but because he's the guy who's a master of logistics and kind of attritional stuff.
Okay, so can you, maybe just speak a little bit more? It kind of flows, and you did touch on it, but you had a whole section called the myth of the decisive battle. And, so a lot of people think like, oh yeah, Stalingrad, that was it. That was and yet you don't think like, so you say here, Stalingrad did not destroy the offensive capabilities of the Wehrmacht. So why is it seen as decisive? Perhaps because of the losses sustained. The 6th Army was all but wiped out, as was the 4th Panzer Army. Total Axis losses were in the 800K to 1 million range. And then you talk about Kiev. We say, but Kiev didn't prove to be decisive because the Soviet Union could replenish its losses. So you want to elaborate on that?
The decisive battle thing is basically it's something. I mean, so people at the time people were claiming. So you want to claim this is a decisive battle because you want to convince your allies and your civilian population the tide has turned. So we're on the way to winning. So ex post, historians or Churchill says El Alamein, which is no one outside Britain, and probably not even Britain, knows much about El Alamein anymore. Like, I don't think Americans, their history of World War II focus on it, but Churchill calls this the decisive battle, actually. And then Stalingrad is seen as the turning point on the Eastern Front. But it's an ex-post appellation. It's an ex-post naming of it, because Hitler has said Kiev was a decisive battle. And no one cares about that anymore, because from his perspective at the time, it looked like it was, because it was the biggest battle up to that point. And so had the Germans basically replenished their losses from Stalingrad, fought the Soviets to some kind of standstill at Kursk or whatever, and made some kind of compromise peace, let's imagine that was possible, then Stalingrad wouldn't loom as large. So the argument is basically it's an ex-post thing. At the time, you don't know if it's a decisive battle. All you know is you lost huge amounts. And the question is, can you replenish them? And the thing I found out in researching for this article was so German land power losses are bad, and they're really bad at Stalingrad. But up to 1944, they're not worse. They're not as bad as German relative land power losses in World War One. I guess Germany was able to sustain those. And similarly, there's a lot of young, basically every year, another batch of young German men are turning 18, and they're eligible for conscription. So you've got this inflow of people. So long as you can equip them, basically, you can replenish your losses. And so whether or not Stalingrad looks big in absolute numbers, like it's a huge defeat, but it seemed to have been the Germans could have recovered from it if that was the only defeat they had.